You messed with the wrong woman. He slapped his wife in front of everyone. But before he could even blink, her brothers stepped in and started beating him right there. The room froze, because they had been watching all along. If you ever touch her again, you won't survive it. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps this channel grow. Now let's begin. The mansion glowed like a jewel against the night. Glass walls reflected the soft gold of chandeliers that hung like dripping light from impossibly high ceilings. Outside, luxury cars lined the curved driveway, sleek black machines that whispered wealth without needing to prove it. Inside, the air carried the scent of expensive perfume, polished wood, and chilled champagne. Everything about the evening was designed to impress. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Cole and his wife, Isabella Cole. They looked flawless. Ethan, in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, moved through the crowd with effortless confidence. His smile came easy, his laughter even easier. He shook hands, accepted compliments, and spoke with the ease of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. Beside him stood Isabella, elegant, composed, beautiful in a way that didn't beg for attention but commanded it anyway. Her gown was a soft cascade of silk, hugging her figure just enough to remind everyone she belonged in this world of luxury. Diamonds rested delicately against her collarbone, catching the light with every subtle movement. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple. But perfection, up close, has cracks. Isabella's smile never quite reached her eyes. It lingered only on her lips, careful and controlled, like something practiced too many times. Her posture was impeccable, but there was a stiffness to it, like she was holding herself together rather than simply standing. Every time Ethan spoke, her gaze flickered toward him, in anticipation,
not in,
as though she was waiting, bracing for something. A guest approached, an older woman with a warm laugh and a glass of champagne in hand. She greeted Ethan first, praising him loudly for his latest business success. Ethan accepted the compliment with a smooth nod, his voice steady and confident as he explained just enough to impress, but not enough to reveal. Then the woman turned to Isabella. There was a brief pause, a moment where Isabella seemed unsure of what version of herself she was supposed to present. She smiled anyway. The woman complimented her dress, her grace, her beauty, everything that was easy to see on the surface. Isabella responded politely, her voice soft, measured, almost too careful. Ethan glanced at her. Just a glance. But it was enough. Isabella's shoulders straightened slightly. Her smile sharpened, becoming just a bit more precise, a bit more controlled. The woman eventually moved on, blending back into the sea of elegant guests. Ethan leaned closer to Isabella. His smile remained in place, but his voice dropped just enough to lose its warmth. He murmured something under his breath, something no one else could hear. Isabella's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. Her smile didn't break, but something behind it did. The night unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance. Music drifted through the air, soft and expensive. Laughter rose and fell in waves, blending with the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversations that revolved around deals, status, and appearances. Ethan thrived in it. He moved from group to group, effortlessly commanding attention. People leaned in when he spoke. They laughed when he joked. They listened when he explained. And Isabella followed. Not beside him. Slightly behind. Always just half a step out of alignment. At one point, a small group gathered near the bar, discussing a recent expansion project. Someone asked Isabella a question, simple, harmless. Her opinion on a design concept. She began to answer. Her voice was calm, thoughtful. She spoke with quiet intelligence, choosing her words carefully but confidently. She didn't get far. Ethan cut in, smoothly, casually, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. He corrected her. Not harshly, not loudly, but enough. Enough to shift the tone. He rephrased her idea, adding his own twist, presenting it as though he was refining something incomplete. The group nodded, more engaged now, more interested in his version. Isabella fell silent. No one called attention to it. No one questioned it. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it happened again and again. Each time Isabella spoke, Ethan found a way to interrupt, adjust, or dismiss, always with a smile, always wrapped in charm, always disguised as something harmless. People laughed it off. Some didn't even notice. But a few did. They saw the way Isabella's voice grew quieter with each interruption. The way her hands folded together more tightly. The way her eyes flickered, not with confusion, but with something closer to resignation. At one point, Ethan placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. A gesture that, to others, looked affectionate. But his grip lingered just a moment too long. Firm. Grounding. Possessive. He leaned in again, his lips barely moving as he spoke to her. Another quiet remark. Another correction. Isabella nodded. Of course she did. Because disagreeing would have drawn attention. And attention was dangerous. So she adapted. She smiled when expected. Spoke only when necessary. Stayed within the invisible boundaries Ethan had drawn so carefully around her. From a distance, they still looked perfect. Up close, the cracks were beginning to show. Vanessa Hart didn't enter the room quietly. She didn't need to. Her presence announced itself before she even spoke. Heads turned. Not because they didn't know her, but because they did. She walked in with confidence sharpened to a point, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that demanded attention. Her dress was bold, fitted, and intentional. Everything about her was designed to be seen. And she was. Ethan noticed her immediately. Of course he did. His expression shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. His posture straightened, his smile deepened, and something in his eyes lit up in a way it hadn't all night. Vanessa approached him like she belonged there. Like she belonged to him. She greeted him first. Warm. Familiar. Too familiar. Her hand lingered on his arm just a second longer than necessary. Her laughter came easily, naturally, as though they shared a private world no one else was part of. Isabella stood right there. Vanessa acknowledged her, but only just. A glance. A thin smile. Nothing more. Then she turned her attention back to Ethan. The shift was deliberate. Calculated. And everyone felt it. Vanessa spoke freely, confidently, inserting herself into conversations, interrupting when she pleased, dismissing when she didn't care. She teased Ethan, praised him, challenged him, all with an ease that felt intimate. Too intimate. At one point, she made a comment light, playful, but sharp underneath. A comparison. Subtle enough to pass as a joke, but clear enough to wound. A few guests exchanged glances. They understood. Even if no one said it. Isabella remained still. Composed. But the air around her had changed. She was no longer part of the center. She had been moved. Quietly. Effortlessly. Replaced. And the worst part. No one stopped it. Not everyone in the room was blind. At the far end of the hall, near the shadowed edge where light softened and conversations faded, 3 men stood watching. They hadn't announced their arrival. They hadn't drawn attention. But they had seen everything. Alexander Reed stood at the center. Tall. Controlled. Still. His gaze was fixed on Isabella. Not casually. Intently. Every movement she made, every shift in her expression, every moment she hesitated, he saw it. Beside him stood Dominic, arms crossed, jaw tight, his patience thinning with every passing second. And Marcus, the youngest of the 3, leaned slightly forward, his focus sharp, his anger barely contained. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The tension between them said enough. Eventually, Dominic exhaled slowly, his voice low. He made a quiet observation about what was happening across the room. Marcus responded under his breath, sharper, more direct. Alexander remained silent. Watching. Analyzing. Waiting. Because this wasn't new to him. He had seen signs before. He had heard things. Small details that didn't sit right. And now, he was seeing the truth unfold in front of him. Clear. Undeniable. Isabella shifted slightly, her gaze lowering for just a second before lifting again. That was enough. Alexander's expression hardened. Something had already been decided. He just hadn't acted on it yet. The night reached its peak. The music grew louder. The conversations are bolder. The alcohol flowed more freely. And Ethan lost restraint. With Vanessa at his side and an audience in front of him, his confidence turned into something sharper, louder, crueler. It started with a comment, then another, then another. Each one aimed at Isabella. He laughed as he spoke, presenting his words as jokes. But there was no humor in them. He mocked her taste, her opinions, her presence. At one point, he made a remark about her being too quiet, suggesting it was a flaw rather than a choice forced upon her. A few guests chuckled, uncomfortable, uncertain, but they didn't stop him. Vanessa smiled, encouraging, enjoying it. Ethan continued, comparing Isabella to her subtly at first, then more directly, praising Vanessa's boldness, her energy, her presence. Everything Isabella was not allowed to be. The room shifted. People began to notice more openly now. The discomfort was no longer hidden. But still, no one intervened. Isabella stood there, absorbing every word. Her expression didn't break, but her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. Across the room, Alexander moved, just slightly, a step forward. Not enough to interrupt, but enough to signal something was about to change. The air grew heavier. Tension thickened. Because everyone felt it now. Something had gone too far, and there was no coming back from it. The air had already shifted. What began as a celebration had turned into something heavier, thicker. Conversations no longer flowed as freely. Laughter came slower, uncertain, as though the room itself was waiting for something it could feel but not yet see. At the center of it all stood Isabella. Still, composed, but no longer untouched. Ethan's words had crossed a line that could not be disguised as humor anymore. The last remark, sharp, deliberate, comparing her to Vanessa in a way that stripped her of dignity, hung in the air longer than it should have. Even Vanessa didn't speak immediately after that one. For a brief second, there was a pause. A fragile opening. And in that moment, Isabella moved. Not physically at first, but something inside her shifted quietly but decisively. Her fingers, which had been wrapped tightly around the stem of her glass, slowly loosened. Her shoulders, once held in careful restraint, straightened, not in fear this time, but in resolve. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried. It cut through the noise without needing to rise. She addressed Ethan directly. There was no trembling, no hesitation, just a simple request. Enough. The word didn't come out as a plea. It came out as a boundary. For the first time that night, Isabella wasn't adjusting to him. She was opposing him. The shift was immediate. Vanessa's lips curved into a slow, knowing smirk, her eyes glinting with amusement as she leaned slightly toward Ethan, clearly entertained by what she saw as defiance. To her, this was a show. To Ethan, it was a challenge. And Ethan Cole did not respond well to challenges. His expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm the room immediately. But the warmth drained from his face, replaced by something tighter, colder. His jaw set. His eyes narrowed just slightly. The ego that had been feeding on attention all night suddenly felt threatened. Because this time, Isabella hadn't stayed silent. This time, she had drawn a line. And worse. People had noticed. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. Another took a slow sip of champagne, eyes flickering between them. The room was watching now. And Ethan knew it. He leaned in closer to Isabella, his voice low enough to avoid immediate attention, but not low enough to hide the tension behind it. He said something sharp. Something meant to put her back in place. But Isabella didn't lower her gaze this time. She held it. Steady. Unmoving. That was the moment everything broke. It happened fast. Too fast for anyone to process before it was already done. Ethan's control snapped, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once. The mask he had worn all night shattered under the weight of his own bruised pride. His hand moved before his mind could catch up. A sharp motion. Suddenly. Violent. And then. Impact. The sound echoed through the room like a crack of thunder. Clear. Loud. Unmistakable. The kind of sound that doesn't just reach ears, but settles into the bones of everyone who hears it. Isabella's head turned slightly with the force of it. Not dramatically. Not exaggerated. But enough. Enough to make it real. Enough to make it undeniable. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The music continued, but it felt distant, like it was playing in another world. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses hovered in the air, forgotten in people's hands. No one moved. No one spoke. Because no one could quite believe what they had just seen. Ethan stood there, his hand still slightly raised, his breathing uneven. Even he seemed to register it a second too late. But it was done. It couldn't be taken back. Across the room, Alexander's gaze sharpened instantly. The shift in him was immediate. Not explosive. Not loud. But absolutely. Dominic's posture straightened, his entire body going rigid as his jaw clenched tighter than before. Marcus took a step forward without thinking, his instincts already ahead of him. Back at the center, Vanessa's smirk faded for the first time that night. Not completely, but enough to show uncertainty. Because this was no longer entertainment. This was something else. Something dangerous. Isabella didn't react the way people expected. She didn't cry. Didn't scream. Didn't even raise her hand to her cheek. She just stood there. Still. Silent. But no longer small. And somehow, that made it worse. Ethan moved again. Whether it was to speak, to justify himself, or to continue, no one would ever know. Because he didn't get the chance. Before his arm could complete another motion, a hand caught his wrist. Firm. Unyielding. Precise. The movement was so controlled, so perfectly timed, it didn't look rushed. It looked intentional. Deliberate. Ethan froze. Not because he chose to, but because he had been stopped. Completely. The grip on his wrist tightened just enough to make resistance pointless. And then, a presence stepped forward from the shadows. Alexander. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply moved into the light, positioning himself between Ethan and Isabella with a calm that felt far more dangerous than anger. His expression was unreadable. Cold. Measured. Final. His eyes locked onto Ethan. Not with rage, but with something far worse. Certainty. He spoke. Low. Controlled. A single command. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. The kind of tone that didn't ask for obedience, it expected it. The room held its breath. Because suddenly, the focus had shifted. Ethan was no longer the center of power in the room. Alexander was. And everyone felt it. The silence didn't last long. Not because it broke, but because it transformed. Dominic stepped forward next, positioning himself slightly to Alexander's right. His presence added weight to the moment, his stance firm, his gaze unwavering. Marcus followed, taking his place on the other side. 3 of them now. United. Unmovable. The dynamic of the room shifted instantly. Guests who had been standing comfortably moments ago now found themselves stepping back, creating space without even realizing they were doing it. Ethan looked between them. Confusion flickered across his face at first, then recognition. Then something else. Something quieter. Something colder. Fear. He tried to recover. Of course he did. He forced a laugh, attempting to brush off the situation, to shrink it back into something manageable. But the sound didn't land. It fell flat. Because no one else was laughing. Alexander didn't release his wrist. Didn't loosen his grip. If anything, it became more certain. More grounded. He stepped closer, just enough to make the difference in control unmistakable. His voice came again. Still calm. Still controlled. But this time, there was weight behind it. A warning. Clear. Direct. Final. Ethan swallowed. The room watched. And for the first time that night, Ethan Cole looked like a man who had lost control of everything. Alexander didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was silent enough that every word he spoke carried effortlessly. He began calmly, not with accusations, but with facts. Measured. Precise. He spoke about patterns, things that had been noticed over time. Small incidents that, on their own, could be dismissed. But together, painted a very different picture. Dominic shifted slightly, pulling out his phone, not in a rushed or dramatic way, but with quiet intention. Marcus remained still, his focus locked on Ethan, ensuring there would be no sudden movements, no attempts to escape the moment. Alexander continued. He mentioned control, manipulation, the slow erosion of someone's confidence. Each word landed heavier than the last. Then, he turned slightly. Not fully, just enough. His gaze flickered toward Vanessa. For the first time, she didn't look composed. Her posture shifted. Her confidence wavered. Alexander didn't need to say much. Just enough. References. Details. Hints that there was more beneath the surface than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Vanessa's expression tightened. Her earlier boldness began to crack, replaced by something far less controlled. Uncertainty. Because whatever she thought was hidden, wasn't. Alexander made it clear. They had seen it. They had followed it. They had evidence. Not speculation. Not suspicion. Proof. The room reacted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle shifts. Glances exchanged. Whispers forming. Judgment settling in. Ethan's breathing grew heavier. His earlier confidence was gone now, replaced by something raw and exposed. For the first time, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. He was inside it. And losing. Vanessa took a small step back. Barely noticeable. But enough. Because the ground beneath her had begun to crumble. And everyone could see it. The illusion was over. The truth had entered the room. And nothing would ever be the same again. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might hold. Like the situation, sharp and fragile, might settle into words instead of action. But Ethan had already lost too much control to stop himself now. His pride, bruised and exposed in front of an audience he once commanded, pushed him toward the only thing he had left: defiance. His breathing was uneven, his jaw clenched tight as he yanked slightly against Alexander's grip. The attempt was weak, more instinct than strategy, but it was enough to show resistance. And then he made the mistake. He shoved. Not hard, not calculated, but deliberate. His hand connected with Marcus's shoulder, pushing him back just enough to cross a line that had already been dangerously close. Everything changed in an instant. The restraint the brothers had been holding on to snapped, not wildly, not recklessly, but with controlled precision. Alexander released Ethan's wrist. Not as a retreat. As a decision. Marcus moved first, stepping back into position with a force that erased the small distance Ethan had created. Dominic followed immediately, cutting off any chance of escape, his movements sharp and intentional. What followed wasn't chaos. It was calculated. Ethan barely had time to react before the first hit landed. Quick, clean, disorienting. It knocked the balance out of him before he could even raise a defense. Gasps erupted across the room. A glass shattered somewhere in the background. Someone shouted, but no one stepped forward. Because it was clear. This wasn't a fight. This was a reckoning. The brothers didn't move like men driven by blind anger. There was no wild swinging, no wasted energy. Every motion had purpose. Every strike was controlled, measured, and exact. Ethan stumbled, trying to regain footing, but he was already overwhelmed. Outmatched. Overpowered. Marcus drove him back, Dominic cutting off his attempt to turn, Alexander stepping in only when necessary, ensuring the outcome without losing control of the moment. The room dissolved into chaos. Guests scrambled backward, creating distance. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others turned away, unable to watch, but unable to leave. Because something about it felt inevitable. Like this had been building long before. Tonight, Ethan hit the ground hard. The sound echoed almost as loudly as the slap that had started everything. But this time, no one was surprised. No one questioned it. Because everyone had seen why. And no one moved to stop it. The transition from inside to outside was abrupt. Cold air replaced the suffocating tension of the room as Ethan was dragged through the grand entrance, his resistance weak, his strength already fading. The door shut behind them, muting the chaos inside into a distant hum. Outside, the night was quiet. Still. Unforgiving. Ethan was thrown forward, his body hitting the pavement with a force that knocked what little breath he had left from his lungs. He didn't get up. Not immediately. Couldn't. His body refused. The man who had stood inside just moments ago, confident, untouchable, admired, was gone. What remained was something else entirely. Broken. Exposed. Humans. Alexander stepped forward slowly, adjusting his cuff as though nothing about the situation had unsettled him. Dominic and Marcus stood slightly behind, watching, ensuring there would be no sudden movement, no last attempt at resistance. Ethan shifted, trying to push himself up, but his arms gave out halfway. A quiet, defeated motion. Alexander crouched down beside him. Not rushed. Not aggressive. Just certain. He studied Ethan for a moment. Not with anger, but with a calm that made the situation far more dangerous. Then he spoke. Low. Even. Controlled. The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried weight simply because of the moment they existed in. A warning. Clear. Final. Not a threat made in anger, but a promise made with certainty. Ethan didn't respond. Couldn't. Because for the first time, he understood something he hadn't before. He was no longer in control of anything. Alexander held his gaze for a second longer, then stood. The decision had been made. The line had been drawn. And there would be no crossing it again. Inside, the energy had changed completely. The music had stopped. The laughter was gone. What remained was something quieter, sharper. Whispers. Low conversations that moved quickly from one cluster of guests to another, spreading faster than the truth itself. The illusion of the evening had collapsed. And everyone knew it. Vanessa moved quickly through the room, her heels striking the marble floor with urgency now instead of confidence. Her posture was different. Tighter. Less certain. She kept her head forward, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to notice the way people were watching her now, not with admiration, but with something closer to judgment. She was almost at the exit when she stopped. Dominic stood in her path. Still. Unmoving. He didn't block her aggressively. He didn't raise his voice. But his presence alone was enough. Vanessa tried to maintain composure, her chin lifting slightly, her expression attempting to rebuild the confidence she had worn so easily earlier. But it didn't land. Because the room had already shifted. Dominic stepped slightly closer. Not enough to invade space. Just enough to ensure his words wouldn't be missed. His tone was calm. Measured. But sharp enough to cut through whatever illusion she was still holding onto. He made it clear, without spectacle, without volume, that whatever image she had walked in with no longer existed. Around them, phones had begun to appear. Subtle at first. Then more openly. Messages being typed. Videos being replayed. The story was already moving beyond the room. Vanessa noticed. Of course she did. Her composure cracked, just slightly, but enough to reveal the panic underneath. Because reputation was everything in her world. And hers was unraveling in real time. She didn't argue. Didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to say. She stepped around him carefully this time. And walked out. Not with confidence. But with urgency. Across the room, Isabella stood exactly where everything had started. Unmoved. Unshaken. Her gaze wasn't on the guests. Wasn't on the whispers. It drifted briefly toward the door. Then settled. For the first time that night, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel humiliated. She didn't feel anything tied to Ethan at all. And that absence. It felt like freedom. 3 days later, the the silence had turned into consequences. The story hadn't stayed contained. It had spread. Quietly at first, then rapidly, moving through the same elite circles that had once praised Ethan Cole. Now, those same circles spoke his name differently. With distance. With caution. With judgment. Meetings were cancelled. Calls went unanswered. Partnerships dissolved with carefully worded statements that avoided scandal, but made the outcome clear. Investigations began, not loudly, not publicly, but thoroughly. Because once attention turned toward him, everything else followed. Vanessa disappeared just as quickly. Her absence was noticeable. Events she would have dominated, she was no longer invited to. Messages she once responded to instantly left unread. The same society that had embraced her now rejected her without hesitation. Because in their world, reputation wasn't just important. It was everything. And once it cracked, there was no repairing it. Meanwhile, across the city, in a quiet office filled with sunlight, Isabella sat at a long table. The atmosphere here was different. Calm. Focused. Controlled. Documents were spread neatly in front of her, organized, precise, waiting. Alexander stood near the window, reviewing details with quiet attention. Dominic leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed, his focus shifting between the paperwork and Isabella. Marcus remained seated, flipping through pages, marking sections that required attention. There was no chaos here. No raised voices. Just clarity. Alexander spoke first, his tone steady, grounded in fact rather than emotion. He outlined what had been uncovered: financial movements, hidden accounts, patterns that pointed to more than just personal betrayal. Marcus added details where necessary, his voice calm but firm. Dominic remained quiet, his presence enough. Isabella listened, not as someone overwhelmed, but as someone absorbing truth. When the papers were finally placed in front of her, there was a brief pause. No hesitation. Just acknowledgement of everything that had led to this moment. She reached for the pen. Her hand was steady. No tremor. No doubt. And then she signed. The sound of pen against paper was soft. But it marked something final. Decisive. The end of one life. And the beginning of another. Weeks later, the city stretched endlessly beneath a skyline of glass and light. The rooftop venue overlooked it all, elegant, exclusive, designed for those who existed at the top of their world. And tonight, Isabella stood among them. But not as she had before. There was no careful positioning. No quiet restraint. No shadow behind someone else's presence. She stood at the center. And people noticed. Not because of what she wore, though her elegance remained undeniable. Not because of who she was connected to, but because of how she carried herself. Confidence. Composed. Unshaken. People approached her differently now. With respect. With intention. Conversations were directed toward her, not around her. Her name held weight. And, for the first time, it was entirely her own. Across the room, quiet conversations still referenced Ethan. His situation hadn't improved. If anything, it had worsened. Legal battles. Financial loss. A reputation that could not be rebuilt. But those words no longer held power over Isabella. They existed. But they didn't reach her. Alexander stepped beside her, his presence familiar, steady. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. When he finally did, his tone carried something rare. Approval. Pride. Isabella's gaze moved across the skyline, the lights reflecting softly in her eyes. She didn't look back. Didn't hesitate. Because there was nothing behind her worth returning to. Only forward. And as she stepped into the space ahead, it was clear. She was no longer defined by what she had endured, but by what she had become. Alone. Powerful. Unshaken. And finally, free. If you enjoyed this story, don't just watch and leave. Like this video, share it with friends and family. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel for more powerful and interesting stories. Bye, see you in the next one.